Alright everybody, and we are back, staying in the Keystone State today, discussing the black and gold, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this is a team that really has known nothing but success over the last couple of decades. So since 2003, they have not had a losing season. That was their most recent losing season. And since Mike Tomlin has been the head coach in 2006, or 2007, I'm sorry, they have had a winning season or a 500 season every single year. And honestly, and when we look to 2023, I think that streak will continue. Although, while they haven't had a losing season since 2003, they haven't won a playoff game since the 2016 season. So it has been 7 years now when they went to the conference championship game against the New England Patriots. And if we want to think even bigger than that, they haven't made it to the Super Bowl since Super Bowl 45 against the Green Bay Packers following the 2010 season, and they haven't won the Super Bowl since Super Bowl 43 against the Arizona Cardinals following the 2008 season. Crazy that that game was already 15 years ago. So, let's take a look at this 2022 Pittsburgh Steelers team. Now, like we mentioned, Pittsburgh didn't have a losing record last year. They finished 9 and 8 under head coach Mike Tomlin. And looking at the more team rankings here, this was a bottom 10 offense, absolutely. While they really didn't turn the ball over that much, which is definitely a good thing, they struggled to put points on the board. They were 26th in terms of points scored last year, which isn't going to win you many ball games. And they were 23rd in terms of yards gained. But looking at the defense, this was a pretty impressive unit last year. They were 10th in terms of points allowed and 13th in terms of yards allowed. While they were last in generating fumbles, they were actually first in interceptions last year. So definitely a defense that was good at generating turnovers against the pass, but definitely very fascinating to look at these defensive stats for the Pittsburgh Steelers last year because they were 28th in terms of passing touchdowns allowed. So they were allowing a lot of passing touchdowns, but they had the most interceptions out of any team. But on the flip side, they allowed the fewest amount of rushing touchdowns last season, but in turn, they generated the fewest fumbles. Just kind of funny how that balances itself out like that. Very, very much a contrast on this Pittsburgh Steelers defense. So they were pretty poor at stopping the pass, but they were excellent at generating turnovers off of the pass. Whereas with the run, excellent at stopping the run, but horrible at generating turnovers off of the run. But anyway, just very fitting for this Pittsburgh Steelers team, as we'll see when we get to the schedule here. So looking at this 2022 schedule, they do initially start off with a very thrilling win over the Cincinnati Bengals in overtime, and definitely seemed like that was setting the tone for a lot of success to come in 2022, but that wasn't really the case. They had their bye week in week 9, and entering that bye week, they were sitting at a 2-6 record with some really ugly losses in here. They lose by 2 scores to the Cleveland Browns on Thursday night in week 3. They lose to the Buffalo Bills in week 5 by a score of 38-3. And then they lose to the Philadelphia Eagles right before the bye week in week 8 by a score of 35-13. So definitely not encouraging stuff here from the Pittsburgh Steelers heading into the bye week. So much so that in week 4, starting quarterback Mitch Trubisky was benched for the only first round quarterback last year, Kenny Pickett, local product, went to the University of Pittsburgh, very familiar with Heinz Field. He steps in and doesn't really have a lot of success in terms of wins at first here, but coming out of the bye week, the Pittsburgh Steelers catch fire, and despite the fact that they had a 2-6 record, they end up with a winning record when all is said and done because they win 7 of their last 9, finishing the season with a 7-2 record, and their only losses being to the Cincinnati Bengals and Baltimore Ravens, each by 1 score. So those were 2 divisional matchups against 2 teams that ended up going to the playoffs. Can't really be upset with that. And granted, while the rest of the schedule isn't overly difficult, definitely some impressive wins in here still, including a win over the Baltimore Ravens in Week 17 by 3 points. So Baltimore was still had their sights set on the playoffs at that point. They needed this win in order to help their playoff positioning. But Pittsburgh had stepped up on a prime time here on New Year's Day and was able to really end their season on a high note. And I think there's a lot of optimism as we head to 2023 for the Pittsburgh Steelers because of that. But looking down here at the individual statistics, like I said, Mitch Trubisky was the starting quarterback initially for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he did not impress. When all is said and done for the season, he ends up with just over 1,200 yards passing for 4 passing touchdowns to 5 interceptions. Very pedestrian numbers for the former top 3 selection. And then rookie Kenny Pickett steps in, the only first-round quarterback last year, as I mentioned. And he really doesn't have a fantastic year either. In 12 starts, he throws for just over 2,400 yards, 7 passing touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. So more interceptions than touchdowns, never a good thing, but I am optimistic about Kenny Pickett going into 2023. It certainly seems the Pittsburgh Steelers have put him in a position for success, as we'll see in a little bit. But looking now at the rushing and receiving stats, Najee Harris, second-year man last year, he was their first-round pick in 2021. He had a bit of a sophomore slump, or so I've been told. Really, these stats don't look bad at all things considered. 17 games started, so he plays every single game last year, crosses the 1,000-yard threshold, and still has 7 rushing touchdowns. Granted, his receiving stats did take a big hit from his rookie year, just 41 receptions for 229 yards and 3 touchdowns, but honestly, that's still pretty good. If you look at his all-purpose stats, he's around 1,250 all-purpose yards and 10 touchdowns with just over 40 receptions. I mean, yeah, it's not as good as what he did as a rookie, but I would take that on my team as a running back, especially somebody who starts all 17 games. The best ability is availability, as we say. So definitely not discouraged by Najee Harris's sophomore campaign. Although I will give a shout out to Jaylen Warren, who, while he never did get to start a game at running back per se because Najee Harris was in the lineup every single week, he did definitely impress when he was on the field. Probably the best indicator of this is one, looking at his receptions. He's able to catch the ball 28 times last year, so really not too far behind Najee Harris, and only 15 yards fewer than Najee Harris through the air, while averaging 2 more yards per reception. Jaylen Warren averages 7.6 yards per reception to Najee Harris's 5.6. And then the other being looking at the yards per rushing attempt. Najee Harris averaged 3.8 yards per carry, while Jaylen Warren averaged 4.9. But both of these guys will be back with the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2023, both at age 25, so both very much in their prime, both on cheap rookie deals. So I don't really see what the problem is. I mean, yeah, maybe Najee Harris isn't going to be the bell cow running back he was in 2021, but I like what the Steelers have in the backfield here going forward, for sure. Then looking at this receiving room, and definitely some standout players here. Nobody crosses the 1,000-yard threshold, but Deontay Johnson starts all 17 games and continues to put up a good showing, 882 yards and through the air with actually 0 touchdowns, quite surprisingly, but really the standout, well, the breakout player, I suppose I should say, is rookie George Pickens, who has 801 receiving yards as a rookie last season for 4 touchdowns as well. And if we want to look at his yards per reception, 15.4 yards per reception last year for George Pickens. By far the most on this Pittsburgh Steelers roster. And then I'll also give a shout out to Pat Freiermuth, their second-year tight end, who ends up with 732 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. So definitely the touchdowns are a little bit lacking here, but I am confident that in Kenny Pickett's second year, he will continue to develop. And the development of George Pickens in particularly, and the emergence of George Pickens, really was kind of the nail in the coffin for Chase Claypool here, who was seen as a potential star for the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple seasons ago, definitely a promising young player for them, but while he was a physical specimen, he really just wasn't fully bought in and fully engaged the way that Mike Tomlin and his staff would have liked. So he ends up getting shipped out at the trade deadline to the Chicago Bears for a second round pick, which the Pittsburgh Steelers do make very good use of, as we'll see in a little bit. Then finally, we'll look at the defensive stats here, and certainly some standout players here. On the defensive line, Cameron Heyward absolutely continues to just keep on trucking at age 33. Starts all 17 games, 10.5 sacks, 1 forced fumble recovery, leads the team in quarterback hits, and tackles for a loss. So props to him for keeping his career going strong as he approaches his mid-30s. And then we'll also give a shout out to linebacker Alex Highsmith and, of course, TJ Watt. TJ Watt does only start 10 games last season, but pretty impressive in those 10 games. And Alex Highsmith at age 25 starts all 17 games and definitely a force here. He has 5 forced fumbles, and keep in mind this was a team that didn't generate many fumbles at all last season, with 14.5 sacks. And if we really want to look at this, Alex Highsmith actually has more forced fumbles than everybody else on this defense combined, so definitely quite the feat there. And of course, give the shout out to Minkah Fitzpatrick. Starts 15 games last year, 6 interceptions, takes 1 back for a touchdown. And as a matter of fact, Minkah Fitzpatrick is one of 3 Pro Bowl selections from this Pittsburgh Steelers roster, alongside Cameron Heyward and TJ Watt, although TJ Watt couldn't attend due to his injury-shortened campaign. But with that being said, let's see what Pittsburgh does in this offseason to keep the ball rolling and really try to get back on track in 2023, try to get back to the playoffs. They do play in a very difficult division. I might even go out on a limb here and say that the AFC North is the most difficult division in the National Football League right now. I know some people might think it's perhaps the AFC East, and that division is certainly going to be very talented as well this season, but I think the AFC North, all 4 of these teams have a very good shot at making the playoffs. And looking at this Pittsburgh Steelers offseason, we can start with the departures. So they lose safety Terrell Edmunds to the Philadelphia Eagles, played 83% of snaps last season. They also lose another player in the secondary. Cornerback Cameron Sutton, as we mentioned in the Detroit video, departs to the Lions to probably be their number 1 corner. He played 87% of snaps last season. Then they lose a pair of linebackers, Robert Spillane to the Las Vegas Raiders, and former top 10 pick Devin Bush moves on to the Seattle Seahawks at just age 25. And then finally, I will mention guard Kevin Dotson moves on to the Los Angeles Rams after playing 100% of snaps last season. So good job to Kevin Dotson there, but that's really the only notable subtractions from this Pittsburgh Steelers roster. So a couple losses in the secondary, a couple losses at linebacker, and 1 loss at offensive guard. So really not too much that Pittsburgh needs to replace here. And let's see what they do in free agency. So they bring in a couple linebackers right off the bat. Cole Holcomb from the Washington Commanders and a Landon Roberts from the Miami Dolphins. And that should be their 2 replacements for Robert Spillane and Devin Bush. But they do still bring in Kwan Alexander for some depth. They do still bring in Marcus Golden for some depth. So Pittsburgh's definitely in a strong position at linebacker. They were able to negate those losses pretty successfully before we even got to the draft. And some of the other players they bring in free agency of note, guard Isaac Seumalo from the Philadelphia Eagles. Versatile offensive lineman, big part of that offensive line that's been consistently ranked as one of, if not the best offensive lines in the NFL during recent years. And Isaac Seumalo should slot in right away as a replacement for Kevin Dotson. But additionally, they do bring in Nate Herbig from the New York Jets, another offensive guard who could rotate in. So Pittsburgh definitely potentially upgrades their offensive line here despite losing a guy who played 100% of snaps last season. And again, we haven't even gotten to the draft yet, so Love this from the Pittsburgh Steelers so far, but we're not even done because they still acquire Allen Robinson from the Los Angeles Rams. And Allen Robinson, while they will still have Deontay Johnson and George Pickens, Allen Robinson could perhaps be more of a replacement for Chase Claypool in this offense, even though Chase Claypool didn't play the second half of the season for the Steelers last year. But that's really it in terms of the additions. They do bring in a couple more depth pieces here. Oh, you know what? Forgot to mention down here at the bottom, they bring in Patrick Peterson and Chandon Sullivan from the Minnesota Vikings. So two solid veteran cornerbacks, Patrick Peterson especially, who can definitely make plays for this Pittsburgh Steelers team, and even Desmond King from the Houston Texans. So Pittsburgh absolutely addresses all of their needs pretty much right away in free agency, at least all of their losses. I won't say all of their needs. So then let's see what they do during this 2023 draft. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers did have 2 second-round picks because of that Chase Claypool trade. And lucky for them, Chicago actually ends up with the worst record in the National Football League. And additionally, Miami had their first-round pick forfeited, so as a result, Pittsburgh ends up with the number 32 overall selection in addition to their own first-round pick. In any typical year, the 32nd overall pick would be the final selection of the first round, but this year Pittsburgh gets it technically as a second round pick. And this draft class, I would say, is one of the better ones in the National Football League. I really would. So Pittsburgh starts off with the 14th overall selection, taking offensive lineman Broderick Jones. And Broderick Jones is somebody who could play both the tackle and guard positions, but Pittsburgh will most likely use him as a tackle in their offense. Although, as we'll see in a second, Pittsburgh might not even need him to start right away, which really shows how strong of a position they are at in terms of their trenches on the offensive side of the football. But then with that 32nd overall pick, they select Joey Porter Jr., son of former Pittsburgh Steeler Joey Porter from that Super Bowl 40 roster. Right out of Penn State, so not far away at all, local product, and he's going to be able to be a real difference maker for this defense right away if need be. But again, as we'll see in a second, Pittsburgh might not even need Joey Porter to start day one either. So definitely love this move. He was a player for the Philadelphia Eagles. I would have loved to have seen them taken in the first round. Obviously, I'm very happy with Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, but Joey Porter Jr. was certainly somebody on my radar. And he was projected to go probably in the teens. I saw him going most often prior to the draft, in terms of mock drafts, of course, but definitely get great value for him at the 32nd overall selection. Then they take Keanu Benton out of the University of Wisconsin in the second round as well, and he's a nose tackle, which definitely fits their 3-4 scheme, and he's somebody who could definitely be a key piece for them going forward. And following that up in the third round, they take Darnell Washington out of the University of Georgia, tight end. And he could be an excellent blocking tight end for them behind Pat Freiermuth, and really gives them a solid 1-2 punch at the tight end position going forward. So you'll notice so far, we're about to break down this depth chart in a second, but Pittsburgh has a deep receiving room right now. Great position on the offensive line. A solid 1-2 punch in the backfield, solid 1-2 punch at tight end. And most of these players are pretty young. So by my estimation, they're putting quarterback Kenny Pickett in a fantastic position for success in his second season. And I still haven't even mentioned Nick Herbig, outside linebacker from the University of Wisconsin. Yet another piece to just help them out on defense, and tremendous value there at the 132nd overall selection. And then to round things out, they take a couple flyers in the 7th round on Corey Trice and Spencer Anderson, cornerback and offensive lineman respectively. But that being said, let's look at this Steelers depth chart after the final 53-man roster has been finalized, and I really do like what I see here. So we could start out on offense like usual with the quarterback position. This is Kenny Pickett's job, not really much of a debate there. They do still have Mitch Trubisky and Mason Rudolph on the roster as a potential backup, but hopefully for the Steelers' sake, those guys won't have to see the field this year. Then looking at running back, as we mentioned, that 1-2 punch of Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. And they do still have Anthony McFarland Jr. in his 4th season on a rookie deal still. Then at tight end, that 1-2 punch of Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington. Love that. Then looking at this offensive line. And while I wouldn't say this offensive line is one of the best units in the National Football League, I'm definitely very encouraged by it. If we're comparing it to some teams we've discussed so far, if we want to talk about teams we've discussed recently, absolutely I would say this is similar to New England's offensive line in terms of just where they fall in terms of the hierarchy of offensive lines in the National Football League. Or if we want to go back a little bit, we could say it's pretty similar to Denver as well. Pretty solid starters all around, but maybe not one guy who's really jumping off the page at you here as a Pro Bowl, All-Pro kind of player. But wouldn't really say there's a weak link here either. They have Dan Moore Jr. starting at left tackle, Isaac Seumalo starting at left guard, Mason Cole at center, James Daniels at right guard, and Chukwuma Okafor at right tackle. Or I suppose Okorafor, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But even then, while that starting 5 may not scream out to you as one of the elite units of the National Football League, we have to recall too, Broderick Jones was not one of those 5 names I mentioned. He will be a reserve for this Pittsburgh Steelers team this year. And that is at least a start. And that's not because they were discouraged by his performance at training camp. They really were just that impressed by Dan Moore Jr.'s. Just his work ethic and how much he's really tried to elevate his game to try to stave off Broderick Jones from taking that job from him. So Pittsburgh's staff feels very encouraged by Dan Moore Jr. And I will say, on the off chance that they have an injury at right tackle, the likely scenario is that Dan Moore Jr. will slide over to right tackle and then Broderick Jones will slot in at left tackle. But we also have Nate Herbig as a reserve for the interior of the offensive line, as well as Spencer Anderson, their 7th round pick from this season. So love the depth that they have on this offensive line. Definitely seems like a unit that's going to put Kenny Pickett in a position for success, as well as the guys in the backfield, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. So then finally we will look at this receiving room. And while I'm not overly impressed with the depth here, I like this 1-2-3 punch a lot. I think that Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, and Allen Robinson should complement each other's games very well. And I think Kenny Pickett will find a lot of success between these 3 guys and the 2 tight ends he has. And of course the running backs, because both of these guys are involved in the passing game as well. So overall, while there probably isn't on this offense really one guy who's standing out to you, it's a lot like this offensive line, honestly, this offense as a whole. Maybe not a star player on this offense. It's a very well-rounded unit, and it's definitely one where I think they'll be able to put points on the board this year. I do. I think this is an offense that should be able to have nice long drives, get down the field, and be able to punch it in the red zone. I think Najee Harris is only going to continue to get better. Same with Pat Freiermuth. I think he's due for a big year. And George Pickens in his 2nd year. If I had to pick 3 guys there that I really like, I'd say those guys. And then also have to mention Jaylen Warren. I think he could have a breakout campaign this year too. And Deontay Johnson, he's always consistent. So a lot of pieces I really like on this offense. So with that being said, let's take a look at this defense now. And honestly, for a team that runs a 3-4, I am very impressed with this defensive line, I will say right off the bat. Of course, Cameron Heyward being a part of that bunch definitely helps matters, but they also have Keanu Benton, their 2nd round pick, projected to start at nose tackle, and then Larry Ogunjabi, I think I got that right, starting as the 3rd down lineman. But they also have DeMarvin Leal, their 3rd round selection from last season as a potential reserve, and Isaiah Loudermilk, their 5th round pick from 2021, potentially rotating in as well. So really like what Pittsburgh has on this defensive line here. And for a team that runs a 3-4, you could very well make the case that this is a top 5 defensive line in the National Football League. So right away, we're starting out guns blazing on this defense. Love what we're seeing so far. And then we get to the linebacker position, which we do have on the interior the veteran acquisitions, Cole Holcomb and a Landon Roberts, with Kawan Alexander, another veteran addition, potentially rotating in, along with Mark Robinson, a 7th round selection from last season. But then we look at these outside linebackers, and of course, TJ Watt, absolute star player in the linebacker position there. Then they have Alex Highsmith, 4th-year man, starting opposite of him, with veteran acquisition Marcus Golden and rookie Nick Herbig rotating in. So love what they have going on at linebacker as well. And much like with the New York Jets, I will say with the Steelers defense, it seems like they have a star player on defense at every level of their defense. And when you have that star player who can really just hold that unit together and can force the opposing offense to demand their attention, it makes life so much easier for these other players around them. And when you can fill out this roster with solid young players and solid veteran players like Pittsburgh has done, that's a recipe for success, especially when you have Mike Tomlin coaching this unit. But then we also have to look at the secondary, of course, and this secondary is, as a whole, I'd say it's probably a pretty average one, but honestly, I think the upside of this unit is very high. So we have to start out at the safety position because we have to mention Minka Fitzpatrick. I'd say by far the best player in the secondary again. So you have Minka Fitzpatrick as your star in the secondary, TJ Watt at linebacker, and then Cam Heyward on the defensive line. Absolutely love it. Absolutely love what they're building here. But then starting opposite of Minka Fitzpatrick, we have Damontae Kazi, the veteran. So definitely no Minka Fitzpatrick, I'll say that much, with Miles Kilbrew and Keanu Neal rotating in. So we could see why this isn't one of the better secondaries in the National Football League because of that. Really not another solid safety on this roster besides Minka Fitzpatrick, but Minka Fitzpatrick is a star player by every means necessary. Then looking at the cornerbacks, we have Levi Wallace on one side and Patrick Peterson on the other. So definitely not super encouraged by that either. Patrick Peterson's definitely a difference maker, but he is also in his 13th season, so can't put too much on his shoulders. But the good news is they do have Joey Porter Jr., who could potentially rotate in here, and I think by the end of the season, he will be a starting corner on this defense, even though he's not listed as one right now. And then in terms of another outside corner option, they have James Pierre in his 4th season. And then finally, Chandon Sullivan at the nickel corner position, backed up by Desmond King. So, like this defense as a whole, like this team as a whole, really don't think there's one glaring weakness that jumps out at me. And that's definitely going to be a big reason why they should be due for a big season this year. Much like this roster honestly reminds me a lot of New England. And it's going to all come down to how their young quarterback plays. With New England, it's Mac Jones. Here, it's Kenny Pickett. If Mac Jones or Kenny Pickett can really take that next step in their development, that is going to mean everything for New England and Pittsburgh competing in this AFC. Because if either of those guys can become even just a top 10 quarterback or even just an above average quarterback, I think these teams could go very far. So that being said, let's look at this Pittsburgh Steelers 2023 schedule. And honestly, it is not too difficult, I will say that. They start off at home right away with a tough matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, but keep in mind, as of when I'm recording this, today's Friday, September 1st. This game is 9 days from now. And as of right now, Nick Bosa has still not reported to 49ers camp. So at least in terms of this matchup, the Steelers have a pretty good chance of not facing Nick Bosa, or at the very least, Nick Bosa in a limited role. So quite possible Pittsburgh could steal this matchup week 1, but we will come back to this. Week 2 against Cleveland on a Monday night. This is going to definitely set the tone for which of these teams is going to be competing for the AFC North crown. And coming into Heinz Field. I know it's not called that anymore, but I'm still going to call it that anyway. On prime time, I do believe the building is going to be rocking for this one, and I give the Steelers the nod here. Then they get two, I'll say, easier matchups here against the Raiders and Texans on the road, and I think they should be able to win both of these matchups pretty handedly. Before in Week 5, they come back against the Baltimore Ravens at home, right before the bye week, and this could definitely be a tough matchup, but as of right now, I give it to the Steelers. Very well could switch this one with the Week 1 result, though, so perhaps they defeat the 49ers but lose to the Ravens, which wouldn't help their divisional record, but still keeps them with their same overall record. But as of right now, we'll give them the victory over the Ravens with the loss to the Niners. Then coming out of the bye, they go on the road against the Los Angeles Rams, and I think this should be pretty much a gimme. Mike Tomlin with 2 weeks of prep against that lowly Rams team. This should be a win by all means necessary. Then they follow it up, though, with the Jacksonville Jaguars coming into town, and this could be a pretty good game, honestly, but do believe Jacksonville just has a little bit more talent on offense, definitely have the better quarterback, so give Jacksonville the nod there, although wouldn't be surprised if Pittsburgh could take this one. Then they stay in Pittsburgh on a short week against the Titans, and I do like the Pittsburgh Steelers here. Tennessee is a very well-coached team, but so are the Steelers. I like the Steelers' talent from top to bottom better, like their advantage in the trenches more than the Tennessee Titans. And honestly, their quarterback might even be better than the Tennessee Titans. Kenny Pickett isn't one of the better quarterbacks in the league by any means, but Ryan Tannehill absolutely isn't either, so like the Steelers here. Likewise against the Green Bay Packers the following week. This could be another really good game. I feel like these teams are going to match up pretty well, but again, where it's going to come down to the quarterback play. We don't really know what to expect from Jordan Love right now, and Kenny Pickett still needs to prove himself as well, but the Steelers are at home. They're going to have a few extra days of rest for this game, so I give it to the Steelers. Week 11, they get their rematch with the Cleveland Browns, and do give this one to the Cleveland Browns. Maybe you could say that the Browns win up here and the Steelers do in Week 11, but I think these teams split, and I just gave the victories to the home teams. Then in Week 12, they get the Cincinnati Bengals for the first time this season, and the Bengals are coming off of a few extra days of rest, and I think the Bengals will be just a little bit too much for the Steelers here. I think the Steelers secondary is going to have their trouble against that Bengals receiving core. While I do like the Steelers in the trenches, especially going up against the Bengals offensive line, I do feel like the Pittsburgh offensive line against Cincinnati's defensive line is a very even matchup, so give the edge to the Bengals here. Then in Week 13, this should be a gimme over the Cardinals. Seems like the Cardinals just want to lose games this season. Then Week 14, this is a Thursday night game that I really think could be a high-stakes game for both of these teams. The Patriots and the Steelers, like I've mentioned in a few videos now, I think this could really be where the Patriots have to face their fate for the season. And this is where Bill Belichick's really going to have to look himself in the mirror and say, if I lose this game, I might not be here after the season, because this could definitely be the game that decides New England's playoff fate. So I expect both teams to come out very motivated for this game, but do give the edge to the Steelers because they're going to need it just as badly. And I do think these are two very evenly matched rosters, and it's going to come down to the quarterback play for sure. So pick your poison there, Mac Jones or Kenny Pickett. Definitely two guys who are young that haven't really proven themselves yet, so definitely intrigued by this matchup. Then Week 15 on a Saturday against the Colts. Like this matchup for the Steelers, Indianapolis is still very much a rebuilding team. Then they follow that up with another Saturday game against the Cincinnati Bengals, this time at home. And I think the Steelers do get the slight edge here, though wouldn't be surprised if Cincinnati did decide to sweep them. Week 17 against Seattle, this will be a hard-fought game on New Year's Eve, but do think the Steelers will just ever so slightly edge this one out. Like the matchup of the Pittsburgh defense against that Seattle Seahawks offensive line. I do think that they're going to force Geno Smith into a couple bad decisions. Then finally in Week 18, we have the Ravens against the Steelers at Baltimore. And this one could very well be for playoff positioning or perhaps even the AFC North crown. But do give this one to the Ravens. I think the Ravens offense is going to be just highly electric this year. So much talent at receiver, plus Mark Andrews, plus Lamar Jackson throwing them the ball. Amazing offensive line. Like I said, this is a very difficult division. So looking at the schedule as a whole, I do have the Steelers with a 12-5 record, and I'm not really going to waver from that too much. Yeah, maybe the Bengals could sweep the Steelers. Maybe the Seahawks could beat them here, but I don't really see that happening. Maybe New England could beat them, but again, I think Pittsburgh is the better team. Maybe they drop one of these two to Tennessee or Green Bay, but at the same time, maybe they beat Jacksonville. Maybe they end up beating San Francisco. Who knows? Maybe they end up beating Baltimore twice, but I don't really see that happening. So I feel like 12-5 is pretty appropriate. Like, we could mix and match some of these around here. But for the most part, I don't really see it being too different from what I have them finishing at. I don't think they'll finish worse than 10-7. I'd say at the absolute worst. I think 11-6 is a pretty fair assessment. Although I would say they finish 12-5 when all is said and done. And while I do have them finishing 12-5, the crazy thing is that actually wouldn't even be enough for them to make the AFC playoffs in at least this projection if the standings went accordingly. But we'll see when we actually get to December and January how this thing shakes out, because it is entirely possible that the Pittsburgh Steelers go 12-5 and they end up making the AFC playoffs. So we shall see. Sorry, just looking to make sure that this was as it was before I move on. Anyways, definitely feeling good about the Pittsburgh Steelers this year. Before we wrap up, we can look at the 2023 and future salary cap outlook for the Steelers. So the Steelers do have quite a bit of cap flexibility right now, although it does project them over the cap next year. They could certainly adjust some things to make that work. So right now, they have a ton of players on rookie contracts. Kenny Pickett, Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, Broderick Jones, all on the offense. Then you still have Keanu Benton on defense, projected to start, Joey Porter Jr. down here. So a lot of youth on the Steelers team. And really not a lot of guys with big money contracts. And the ones that do have it, for the most part, deserve it. Minkah Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Cam Heyward, only signed for 2 years too, so not a huge commitment there. Larry Ogunjobi signed for 3 seasons, but not at a massive salary cap hit, just over $10 million. Then Isaac Seumalo signed just over $10 million for the next couple seasons, but really not too heavily invested into this Steelers roster right now. Like Deontay Johnson making around $16 million, but for the most part, Pittsburgh does have a very flexible cap situation right now and will definitely set them up for short-term success. So while I don't necessarily believe Pittsburgh is in a position to emerge from the AFC as the victor when playoff time comes around, I do think they're a team that has a roster that's capable of competing for perhaps the AFC North crown and definitely an AFC playoff position. But who knows, if Kenny Pickett can take another step in year 2, I mean, his stat line doesn't need to be anything extraordinary either. If he could just have maybe like a 20 touchdown season to less than 10 interceptions, if he has like a Daniel Jones type of season from last year, the Steelers are making the playoffs and they might even be able to win a game or two. We'll see, but I'm very encouraged by the Steelers roster, and I would love to hear from any Steelers fans out there down below. How do you think the Pittsburgh Steelers do this year? Am I overrating them at 12-5, or do you think that this Pittsburgh team is really that legit? Do you think that they're going to be one of the teams that's really a reason why this AFC is so deep this season? So, love to hear from you guys down below, and we will be talking about the San Francisco 49ers in the next video. Definitely one I am very excited for. So, look forward to talking to you guys then. Have a nice day, everybody.